This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on Roaring Twenties, the expansion of the U.S. economy. After World War I, GNP decreased and unemployment increased due to the decreased war demand. However, this is a temporary effect. It usually changes very quickly once wars are done, and there was a quick rebound due to new technologies and new products. Henry Ford's assembly line began producing one car every 90 seconds on average. Electricity became more widespread to suburban neighborhoods. A.P. Giannini created the Bank of America in order to introduce the personal checking and savings accounts. New household items like refrigerators became commonplace. The radio was created and made private in America and then widespread to people's homes. From 1922 to 1929, overall GDP increased by 24%. The impact of all these new technologies and new events was that people began feeling like they had achieved the American dream and achieved the middle class status. Suburbanization. There was also, along with the American dream status, an increase in people moving from urban centers into suburban neighborhoods. This had a psychological shift, as people felt that they had achieved that middle class status, and this went along with the symbols of what they were achieving inside of these households. They began using and buying up irons, washing machines, central heating, and automobiles. Companies began to use more aggressive advertisement techniques to gain new consumer markets. Take a notice that suburbanization was demonstrating that Americans had finally achieved that American dream, and notice which Americans we're talking about here. These were descendants of those new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. So this began giving Americans a sense of optimism. The stock market boom. During the 1920s, from 1922 to 1929, the stock market saw a dramatic increase for several reasons. First, mergers between companies had increased, allowing for the pooling of resources. Mergers also began to interlock different types of markets. So, for example, car companies would start investing in real estate markets. Also, people would begin buying on the margin. That meant that people could put 10% down on a share of stock while borrowing the other 90%. Holding companies were created to pool shares of these stocks together and then to manage them. This increased the base of investment into the stock market and allowed for companies then to increase their investments into other types of businesses. Cultural changes. Parents at the time saw this booming economy and this movement into the middle class as a way to make sure that their children would have a better life than they did. This created a youth culture. As parents started to send off their kids into boarding schools and started to provide more material goods for them, a youth culture was created that redefined children according to their age development. Before this time period, there was no real teenage time period. In fact, teenagers, in essence, are a social construction. People in the past used to go from being children straight into adulthood. But now, there was a teenage group that had its own defined needs and desires. This led to a freer understanding of youth autonomy and sexuality. For example, in a lot of these boarding schools, children began having parties called petting parties. I'll leave that to your imagination. Also, the car allowed for children to travel to other cities to meet other people, and the backseat allowed for a lot of other activities. This also created new markets for major companies to appeal to, youth markets for consumerism. Swing music. Another advancement of this time period, especially amongst the youth generation, was swing music. Jazz and swing music became a rebellion against traditional forms of music. Jazz actually, in its original terminology, meant sex. And the purpose of jazz was to challenge the traditional music's way of doing things based upon math, order, and harmony. Swing and jazz were based upon improvisation, creativity, individuality, and rapid change. The dance moves at the time period required little clothing and quick movements. This reflected new sexual attitudes about body movement and space. A good example of this was Duke Ellington, who was one of the greatest jazz heroes of the time. He played in bars and brothels and brought this new form of spontaneous and innovative forms of music. Flapper girls. Along with the challenge that youth brought, were also brought challenge on gender and sex. Traditional beliefs on femininity were based upon the private-public distinction or binary. In the private, household was considered to be safe and nurturing and seen as feminine. The public sector was seen as where the government and business were a part of, and there was a social jungle of aggression and competition. Flapper girls bridged that gap by doing public activities usually seen as only for men. For example, flapper girls would wear shorter hair. They danced in public. They smoked cigarettes. They sat with their legs crossed. All this may not sound all that significant, but what they were doing was challenging this notion that there was an inherent difference between males and females based upon sex. What flapper girls were doing was to say that this was a social construct, and that in fact there was a degree of difference between men and women, not an absolute one. The most famous example was the Hollywood actress Clara Bow. Youth culture. The 1920s developed an ideal of the youth culture. Youths were symbolized as innovative, progressive, and competitive. For example, Babe Ruth was seen at this time period as a sports example of a young man who overcame alcoholism in order to succeed. Charles Lindbergh, who flew the Spirit of St. Louis on the first transatlantic voyage from New York to Paris without refueling, was another example of the youth culture. What youth culture stressed was this individuality, this young person's attitude towards challenging nature itself in order to change society. The Harlem Renaissance. African American culture itself went through major changes as the Great Migration in which blacks moved from the South into northern cities. One of the biggest changes of this time period was through the New Generation in Harlem. It stressed the importance of multiple aspects to African American identity. Leaders of this time period in the African American community, like W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, had stressed the problem of white racism and white oppression. They criticized racism, but these new leaders who arrived in the Harlem generation not only criticized racism, but also criticized the leaders like W.B. Du Bois for limiting black identity only to politics. For example, Zora Neale Hurston argued that the black experience was more than just the issue of white oppression. The Harlem Renaissance, through its music, art, poetry, and drama, wanted to expand black identity. They no longer wanted to focus on the racist stereotypes of racist whites, but they also didn't want to focus on W.B. Du Bois' focus on politics only. Instead, they wanted to show that black people made up the fullness of human experience. Back to Africa. Another movement that arose at this time was a much more radical movement in the African American community. It was led by Marcus Garvey, who established the UNIA, or United Negro Improvement Association. The UNIA promoted a radical separation of blacks from the white population by recolonizing Africa. Eventually, Marcus Garvey was imprisoned over mail fraud, and then he was sent to Jamaica. And at that point, because it lacked his leadership, the movement collapsed. But in the long run, this Back to Africa movement would be essential in establishing Malcolm X's philosophy in the 1950s and 1960s. The Lost Generation. There were a group of writers, primarily white, who did not see this time period as optimistically as others did. They criticized the period as stuck in materialist conformity. They included Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, William Faulkner, and Sinclair Lewis. In their literature, they argued for individuals to risk their individuality by breaking out of the norm of suburban material reality. The development of movies. One of the technological innovations of the time period was Hollywood's development. The Technicolor Corporation provided color movies in 1927. Talkies were created, with pictures having a soundtrack, and the cost of movies was reduced to about 5 cents for a show. Movies were constantly battling, though, between the challenges of cultural norms especially and self-censorship, especially on the issues of nudity and language. What we notice here happening is the creation of a new sense of middle-class confidence. Now middle-class people, remember primarily these descendants of new immigrants, could afford to have luxury consumerism. Traditional reactions. At the same time that there had been some criticism over the optimism of this time period, there were also some reactionary criticisms as well. Fundamentalist religious groups reacted to the cultural changes criticizing the idea of modernism. Modernism is a belief in science, secularism, rationality, and individuality for the purposes of progress. Traditionalism is a belief in faith, religion, wisdom, and community for the purpose of order and stability. Traditional religious leaders criticized the newer, looser beliefs on sex, gender, and the respect of elders. Traditional reactions 2. One of the examples of this is the Scopes monkey trial. In that trial, John Scopes, a public high school teacher in Tennessee, was recruited by the ACLU to teach evolution in the public schools. They did this because they wanted to challenge a Tennessee law that had said you could not teach evolution in the public schools. The case was taken to court where Clarence Darrow, arguing for free speech for the ACLU, and William Jennings Bryan, arguing for traditional education of the young, argued out the case. Darrow eventually called Bryan to the stand and criticized his belief in the literal interpretation of the Bible. Bryan won in court, but he lost in the public perception over the radio. Traditional reactions 3. The KKK at this time period arose once again and broadened its goals. They no longer only attacked African Americans, now their vision criticized new immigrants as well as being un-American. The biggest example is their Emergency Quotas Act. This act made immigration based upon 2% of the amount of immigrants arriving from each country in 1890. This effectively limited the number of Eastern, Southern Europeans, and Japanese into the country. Why? Because back before 1890, there were very few immigrants coming into the country from those countries. By limiting immigration to 2% of that time period, it limited immigration to a very small number before 1890. The KKK also did a massive march at this time period against immigrants in Washington, D.C. The reason why this is so important is that here the KKK, doing this massive march in the Capitol, was able to get away with this, demonstrating how strong nativist feelings and racist feelings were at the time. Traditional reactions number 4, the Red Scare. An overlap with this had to do with what was happening with the new immigrants and the fear of radicalism. In 1920, Attorney Justice Palmer began the first Red Scare, in which he rounded up supposed communists and anarchists. At the time, out of the 50 million Americans who lived, only 70,000 were a part of the Communist Party. But the fear was these new immigrants were bringing in radicalism. A good example of this was the Sacco and Vanzetti case. In that case, these two Italian immigrants, who professed to be anarchists, were accused of having murdered a guard in Massachusetts. They were shown in court for having been anarchists, and this eventually led to their conviction and eventual execution. However, the evidence was entirely circumstantial. The question was whether the case's final outcome was based more upon prejudice to immigrants and the fear of communism than what actually happened. The politics of laissez-faire. The three major presidents in the 1920s were Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. The main goal was to reduce taxes, especially on the top income earners, in order to drive the economy. Harding initially pursued capitalist association, where the government would work voluntarily with businesses in order to try to create goals for overall economic development. This eventually led to several scandals, one of the most important being the Teapot Dome scandal, which revealed that the government officials had been taking bribes to sell off oil land in Wyoming. This led to further distrust on the effectiveness of the government, and the next president, President Coolidge, who became far more laissez-faire than Harding had been. By the end of the 1920s, there were a number of major structural problems with the economy. Wages had increased by 11%. Corporate profits had increased by 65%. But 70% of families were only making $2,500 per year. 80% of families lacked significant savings. In 1926, companies began to stop providing increase in jobs. Also from 1926 to 1929, we saw a decrease, or a stagnation, in real wages. A real wage is when a wage rises in relationship to the increase in prices in order to be able to buy things. Eventually, we saw the first major crash in the market on October 24th of 1929, and a second crash then took place very quickly after that on October 28th of 1929.